Alright, the 6.4 is absolute value. So our key idea is that absolute value of a number is the distance between the number and 0 on a number line. The absolute value of a number A is written as, you put 2 lines and have your A in between it just like that. So draw out a number line like this. We're going to represent the absolute value of -2. So the first thing you would do is you would plot your number on the number line. So I've got -2, and then the definition of absolute value is the distance between the number and 0 on a number line. So we start at the number and we go all the way over to 0, and then we count how many values that is, so the distance between. So we went 1, 2 places. So our absolute value of -2 equals 2, because you're moving 2 places. Now let's look at if we had the absolute value of 2 instead of -2. What would that equal? Well, you plot the number. What is the distance from that number to 0? 1, 2. So my answer would also be 2. It's because it's the distance, and that's what I think is the most confusing part of it. Anytime you have a negative, it automatically becomes a positive because it's just the distance to 0. So even if it was -100, the absolute value, it would take you 100 units to get to 0. So example 1 is finding absolute value. And if the directions stated find the absolute value of 3, you would first of all graph 3 on a number line. Okay, so we graph 3, and then we figure out what the distance between 3 and 0 is. So if you started here and I went over to 0, it would be 1, 2, 3. So the absolute value of 3 equals 3, and that would be my answer. So the same thing goes for fractions or decimals or anything like that. If we have the absolute value of -2.5, we would first start by graphing it on a number line. So remember when you're making a number line to make sure that you have equal intervals. In this case I did them by halves, although I did not put in all of the halves. You can see that there's a line that represents, so here's 0, -1, or -1/2, -1, -1.5, and so on. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to graph -2.5 on the number line. So this would be -2.5. And then to find the absolute value, you just measure the distance between -2.5 to 0. You put it like this if you wanted to. And you realize that it ends up being 2.5. So -2.5, the absolute value, equals +2.5, because that's the distance from what we graphed of -2.5 to 0. Pretty easy. So example 2 is a little bit different. It's comparing values. So if we were comparing 2 and the absolute value of -5, it would look like this. The first thing you're going to want to do is graph both 2 and -5, the absolute value, on a number line. So be careful, and that's what you're going to do is we're going to compare 2 and the absolute value of -5. So we graph 2 on our number line, and then we're going to graph the absolute value of -5, which happens to be 5 on a number line. So what we can realize is that 2 is to the left of the absolute value of -5. So your answer would be 2 is less than the absolute value of -5. So the confusing part about this one is that we're graphing the absolute value of -5, which happens to be 5. So if you had to, and you wanted to do a little number line up here to figure out what my this was negative 5 here. So that's how we started. We said, okay, if we have negative 5, what is my distance to 0 if this were absolute value? And it would be 5, positive 5. So we took that positive 5 and we graphed it. That's what we're comparing. We're not comparing negative 5 and 2. We're comparing the absolute value of negative 5, which happens to be 5. So you have to solve this first and then put them on the number line to compare them. So this one can be a little tricky, but you got to follow those steps. Okay, so try it. So the first 3 are finding the absolute value. So all you got to do is tell me what the absolute value is. And then numbers 4 and 5, you have to copy and complete the statement using the less than, greater than, or equal to sign. Make sure for 4 and 5 you use a number line to prove it. The other 3 you do not need to. And your answers will be on the other side. And your answers will be right here in just a second. Make sure you took good notes, and I'll see you in the morning.